theme areas within a CYFAR. And so your program or your idea needs to fit one of those. It can fit more than one of them, but you really need to link it to at least one of them, because that's what you're going to have to report on it if you do get funded. I think actually one of the roundtable people mentioned, hey, if you have a chance and you know someone who got a CYFAR grant, you can contact them and see if they're willing to share the grant so you can see what a successful grant looks like. You can read the abstracts of other funded projects related to CYFAR. One thing, CYFAR is very different than, if you will, a traditional like AFRI, ag research initiative, or it's not a research grant, it is a program grant. So it is designed to deliver educational programs to a specific audience. So keep that in mind. And the last thing to think about, and I think it's one of those things we forget, is having someone read it and having them be really blunt. Like, I don't understand what you're doing, or why are you doing this piece? How does it connect to the rest? So really giving folks the power to be critical, constructive, provide constructive feedback, I think is really important. Just to stop and say, Dr. Williams mentioned yesterday that it would be sometime in the winter that the RFP would come out. Well, you can get online right now and get the 2018 RFP. And I think Autumn mentioned that, it may change a little. My bet is it won't change tremendously. So you could start with that as sort of your blueprint. And it would be time to start doing that now. That is, to thinking about our partnerships, thinking about what we want to do, and even to start writing so that you would have time to share it with a colleague, say in January or early February, and the RFP hasn't even come out yet, but you're already ahead of the game. Next slide. So this is really important. I think Carolyn said she'd gone to some trainings on grant writing. I've been to several trainings on grant writing. I've written a lot of grants. I think I do a better job now than when I started. And I'll say that there are a lot of great ideas out there. And that's one part of a grant is having a good idea. The second part is really being able to have a persuasive argument as to why your proposal is not only a good idea, but will really achieve the kind of outcome CYFAR is trying to achieve. So the next thing is to think through, you really want to be, when you use words, you really want to be careful to think through who's reading it. So one of the things that one of the reviewers said to me is, on average, they may read 5 or 6 proposals. Now, CYFAR proposals aren't extremely long, but if you're reading 5 or 6 of them, it's really important that it's a nice, logical read for folks. And so starting out with that clear roadmap in the beginning, here's what we're going to cover, is really important. Being clear and succinct is critical. And then really thinking about what are the places where you're using jargon, where you're using a lot of acronyms, proofreading for grammar and spelling mistakes are really critical, because you have to appeal to, so your reviewers on a CYFAR grant will not just be people that have, for example, done work in CYFAR-like areas, but they'll be, for say, an agronomy specialist from the University of Wyoming. I'm making up that, but they're not necessarily folks that work on youth programming or parenting programs. They're folks that are extension folks that may have a very different perspective. So thinking about writing clear, succinctly, so that anyone can follow what you're saying and you make sense as to why you're doing what you're doing. Next slide. Okay, this is a place where I learned the most. One of the things I learned the most when I was writing, going to a couple grant trainings. I was trying to fit as much as I could into that. So if it was 12 pages and they didn't give the font, I'd go down a 10-point font. and often nowadays, and I think for CYFAR, I don't quote me, but I think it's 12-point font, but I could be wrong. And so they specify all that. And remember, why is it so critical to think about these kind of things? If I'm reading 5 or 6 proposals, and I'm reading your proposal, and it's really hard for me to read. It's it's cramped. It's wordy. It's not clear. I have to connect the dots myself. Then all of a sudden I'm getting a little frustrated, and that frustrated can come out as, well, it's not a good proposal. I mean, it may be a great proposal in a way, but it's not written in a way that takes into account that the reviewer has to read it in a reasonable amount of time, in addition to reading several other things over time. So you really want to be thinking about how you use space as your friend. One little trick, though, because I'm real careful on this, but you don't need 2 spaces after a period. That's one way to save a little bit of room. I'll just give you that as a little cue here. Next slide. So these are really important. So when we look at proofreading secrets, and this is really the critical point, right? Because if I'm a reviewer and I'm going, you're my 4th or 3rd proposal, and there's a lot of spelling errors, or there is some words missing, that I'll just say, for me, as a professor, if I have a student that gives me a paper that has that, they're going to get dinged pretty hard, because you have the tools necessary to do this well. And I'm asking you to do it well because I'm giving my time as a reviewer to do that. So it's really important to take the time to make sure this part is right. A couple things that I do, not everybody does it. Everyone has their own way of doing it, but you can read backwards. That's time consuming. I will tell you that right now. It takes a while to get used to doing that, but it's a great way to catch things. I'll say that. You need to, for me, I need to let it go one evening and come back to it the next morning. So finding a way to step away and get back to it. The point is, you want to do the best job you can to make a clear plan and not irritate the reviewer, right? Because we're all human, right? And so if I'm going through 5 or 6 of these, and you wrote a proposal, but it's really irritating, like you kept spelling something wrong, or you weren't paying attention to the spacing or something, maybe I don't mean for it to bias me, but it could bias me, right? And so you want to make it easy for me to follow your logic, to see the plan, and to really to enjoy reading your proposal. Next slide. Oh, yeah, be consistent. I think that's really important. It's one of the few things that requires, for me at least, when the proposal is all done, I literally go through it again, not looking at anything but consistencies. Am I bolding my titles, my sections? Am I using the same spacing? Am I using the proper words? And that I've said I'm going to use this word for this. So if I'm talking about youth, then I'm using youth and not youth and young people, per se. Even though they're going to changeable, you want to try to help it easier for the reviewer to track who you're talking about. Okay, next slide. So this is a little, I'm going to read this because I think it's funny. This is a little, you could run this on your spell check and you'd be surprised as to how well you would do here. Beware, I have a spell checker. It came with my PC. It plainly marks, that is, for my review mistakes I cannot see. And you get the gist here, right? That the reality is, even with a spell checker and a grammar checker, that these things can go wrong, which is really critical. You have the time built in to write it, step away, reread it, share it with a colleague. I think Autumn and Ron talked about working on this as sometimes having a team of folks. which is fine. That's where, when you do that, though, you need to allow enough time to pull it back together. Make sure you've got consistency in the voice that you're using, and whether you're using active or passive, and really making sure there's consistency in the writing style if you're doing it as a group. But this is one place where taking the time and giving it to someone not necessarily on your writing team, but saying, look, I really want you to spend the time to look for spelling and grammar mistakes, because it's a place where all of a sudden the reviewer, you could really irritate a reviewer quickly if in fact you don't pay attention to those kind of things. Okay, now for CYFAR, and I think this is really important. Sometimes we don't mean to, we get busy. You guys know, come winter of 2021, there'll be an RFP. So what is really critical is not to wait till January of 2021 to start thinking about their partners and contacting them, but rather think about your partners now, and by the end of October, November, set up a time to chat with them, see if they're interested in the idea, maybe encourage them to be a part of the conversation of what the idea should look like, so that you could draft some points in your letter you want. So in the letter, they should be able to talk about what they are specifically bringing to this effort, what excites them about this effort, and how it will meet a need they see in the community. Okay. If there is an actual memorandum of agreement you need to have in place, if you can have that in place, great. I will tell you that in all my years of doing this, I've never had an MOA in place, but I have letters, right? And the letters are on appropriate letterhead, and they're clear that the partnering agency really actually knows their role and responsibility and actually knows what the project is about. So it may be you don't get the letter done until it's closer to the end, but you need to get the buy-in and the opportunity for these folks to have a voice. And that's why it's so critical to bring them into the process and have those conversations, so you can get those letters of support and commitment done, say, January, early February, before the proposal's even out sometimes. Next. Okay, submitting your application. I think for everyone there, or almost everyone, you should have an office of sponsored programs, an office of extramural funding, an office of grants and contracts that will have experience of submitting a federal grant, because nowadays all federal grants are done via virtually and through electronics. They're not done with, used to be, believe it or not, about 20 years ago, they were done and you'd mail 5 copies of your grant proposal in so they could be reviewed. If you want to understand that process, or if in fact you do not believe your university has that, you would go to grants.gov and really look at the process and understand that. But the vast majority of colleges and universities have an office that deals with this, and they'll be the ones that submit it, because your university will want to review your budget and make sure that you've calculated everything right and that they're committed to the effort. And again, finally, you can also, the grants.gov does have online help and step-by-step instructions, and they're pretty good. What I would encourage you to do, I did say it before, was to get to NIFA, search CYFAR, and pull up the 2018 RFA, request for application, because I do believe it's likely that the 2021 RFA will look similar. What happens in the review process, and this is straight out of talking to reviewers, but also Dr. Williams would tell you this. First thing that happens with each application is it's screened to see if it meets the administrative requirements described in the RFA. And if it doesn't, it's thrown out. So if it comes in a day late, it's thrown out. If it doesn't have a few of the forms that are required, it's thrown out. And so those are things that are done before the reviewer has any chance of looking at it. Then it's actually evaluated by the technical review panel. And while the technical review panel is a group of individuals, they're not all individuals who have expertise around the type of program when we do it CYFAR. So again, really important to think about how, in fact, you write it so that everyone understands what you're planning on doing and everyone gets the logic of your effort. What I did do was take a sort of a poll of several reviewers to ask them what they look for. Here are the things that showed up. All these are mentioned by no less than 3 or more reviewers. So first, in the RFP, it's actually outlined how many points each section is. So pay attention to that. If something is 25 points and something is 5 points, doesn't mean the thing that's 5 points is not important. But for me, for spacing reasons, it's certainly not going to get the same amount of space as something that's 25 points, right? And so paying attention to the criteria and thinking about that in terms of the amount of effort and space you put into that section should play out. Indications of strong partnerships. This plays out very, very largely in CYFAR because there is such a community-based model to it, which is why the letters of support are critical. And by letter of support, it's not just signing off saying this is a great idea. Remember, it's about, I think this is a need. Here's our organization's commitment to try to be a part of this effort. And it may be small, or maybe I'm going to help recruit youth. Maybe I'm going to provide a space or something, whatever that is. But it's important to be detailed enough so you know that the letter really indicates that they really are understanding what's going on. CYFAR has sustainability built from the get-go. And so you'll see when you work, if you get a CYFAR grant, when you work with your coaches, you'll see they'll spend a lot of time with you on sustainability planning. In the proposal, they ask for you to think about sustainability and talk about your initial thinking around that, what initial plans. That's important, right? Because it shows that if you can outline how this could end up being sustained, that makes a really strong argument. And then this one is interesting. I would have never picked this one. Apparently, often the letter from the extension director is missing. Okay, and it'll still go forward to the reviewers, but what several reviewers said is without a letter from the extension director, a letter that clearly indicates that he or she understands and is supportive of this work, that the reviewers, they'll review it, but it loses quite a bit of credibility. So that'd be an important thing to think about. Okay, next slide. So successful proposals excite the reviewers, are easy to read and understand. You're clear. You have a clear direction of how you're going, what you're trying to achieve. It's laid out logically. You understand who's contributing what and how these community partners are playing a role. And that project description doesn't leave a lot of question marks. Again, not all written. I put this here because I think it's really important, right? If you're a really good grant writing person, you'll be at 20%, which means 1 out of every 5 gets accepted. So be prepared not to get accepted, and to try again. I think that's really one of the messages we want you to hear is it's okay to keep trying. The next slide really gives some examples of resources that are available to you. I think there are some really good ones there, and certainly would encourage you to make use of them. And then what I'd like to do now is open it up for questions and to see if folks have any questions for me. I'll just add one thing because it came up earlier in our breakout group. There was a question about how important food is to the community and pulling people together. And food overall is, as Mark pointed out, is one of those things that the budget really doesn't allow for. But if food was part of the educational program, so for example, if you were teaching healthy eating habits and you were showing how to make a nutritious meal, and that's part of the actual program, then it becomes easier to justify. And so that's one of those things you want to think about is when you're making something like that, then it becomes, and it really is clear that it's part of the program, it's part of the educational material. It's much easier to see how it could fit. Are there any questions?
Folks were asking in the chat, are stipends allowed or contracts with, I'm guessing that means subcontracts with other vendors?
So subcontracts are allowed. Depending on what they're doing, you'd have to, of course, your university would have its own rules, but the NIFA certainly allows it. One of the rules, though, that NIFA has is that that no more than 49% of the budget can go to a subcontract.
Just realized, Danny, that I've been sending you messages with responses to the questions for everyone. So let me redo this.
Okay, sorry.
And then Melissa also had a follow-up question about contracts for community professionals.
Sure. So if I'm understanding the question, if in fact you were wanting to hire a community organization to work with young people specifically on a unique on STEM, say, and they were they were the local science museum or something like that, and you wanted to hire them to do some work with young people, that is allowed. Yes, it would be allowed. You'd want to have that written out, figured out how it plays out. What does it look like for your logic model? But it certainly is allowable. Of course, you still need to read the RFI. There's, as Mark pointed out, there's some rules there. But generally speaking, I have seen subcontracts such as that. Could we pay program fees to a partner on behalf of the participants? I wouldn't want to answer that because I'm not sure I have the correct information on that. That would be a question. My gut is probably not, but I don't know that. That would certainly be a question for NIFA and Dr. Williams. If in fact you could think about that program being part of your program, it becomes a different conversation. Other question? No. Right. Yes. Part of the larger program, and actually it's just a component of your program, right? It's not separate. I think that's really an important part of that conversation.
We have seen some folks waive program fees recently, right. Like as part of COVID, folks have been allowing virtual participants and waiving the fee to get more folks to register for a slightly different type of program.
That's a great point, Steph. Other comments or questions?
I wanted to piggyback on something you said, Danny, about resubmitting, or, only 20% of your grants might hit. And I think I've seen some statistics where at most 10% of applications to most government competitions are funded. So there's a good chance that you might not be among the grants selected, but you've put a lot of time into it. So thinking about either how can you take the reviewers' feedback and improve what you've put in, or is there another home that would be a better fit for the work you've done?
Yeah, it's a great example. I did an NSF grant one, and to be honest, it was I think the best grant proposal I ever wrote in my life. It went through one round of reviewers. They had some really good points. We really worked on it, submitted it again. It gets a whole new set of reviewers. They had they really liked several points that the other reviewers had us fix, right? And they came back with a few other adjustments, and we tried for a third time and yet another sound. So you have to be thick-skinned. It's really critical because I mean, if you are at 20%, like I said, that's an amazing hit rate. Most people are not. Most people are at 10% or lower.
And there's another question in the chat about cost sharing, whether it's encouraged, allowed, or required.
It is not required. It is certainly it would not look poorly. What I will say for Penn State, they rarely want you to cost share unless it is a requirement because there's a lot more paperwork with cost sharing. I'll say it that way, at least from our university side of the house.
And that does vary. I know grant to grant sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. So some grants, I had recently got a CDC grant, Center for Disease Control, and they did require that. So that's right.
All right.
Other comments or questions?
Well, Danny, this is Mark. I've heard folks repurposing their grants and taking them to their institution's foundation to see if they would fund the idea, or if you're at a 1994, a tribal council may have funds. You may what I would assume would be kind of the equivalent of a board of regents almost, but you may be able to take your idea and get them to fund it.
It's a great idea, Mark.